Okay. Can you all hear me okay? I've got a bad cold, so I apologize if I get a little raspy here. For those of you who attended last year's reflection on season 1 of The Chosen, you're going to see we changed the format a bit. Instead of showing a clip and commenting on that clip, this year we decided to forego the screening for a couple of reasons, because this way we could take a broader look at the complete episode, because each episode has so many different meanings, so many different layers and everything. And what we were doing before, just kind of making it just kind of giving us a narrow perception of the events that took place. So with that in mind, I'd like to break down season 2, episode 1 into 3 segments. The first one is that interview that we began with John. As he's starting to write, his Gospels. The second is the rebuke of Big James and John with their prejudice towards the Samaritans, and of course giving them their new nickname, Thunder, right? And the third part is that twist on the story of the Good Samaritan, which I thought was very clever the way they did it. It was very interesting. So we'll begin with John interviewing those who were close to Jesus' ministry. And if you recall, those interviews are taking place shortly after Jesus died, either before his resurrection or right after. I don't think it was too clear in there the way it was, but it must have been, I would think it was before he presented himself to the disciples up in the upper room, because a lot of the questions that John was asking, these were being asked during Shiva, the Jewish period of mourning, which I think is a week or something of that nature, where they call sitting Shiva, that period of mourning when someone dies. And for John, these interviews were important, that they be done as soon as possible, for fear that, as he said, as people get older, memories tend to fade. And obviously, the only way to record events and keep them, as a legacy, is to write them down and pass them on to future generations. So John wanted to make sure that what was being passed down was accurate. Now, if you'll remember, Mary questioned John as to why he's also writing about Jesus, because Matthew and Mark were also recording his stories. But John makes an interesting comment when he says that the others, especially Matthew, are writing what Jesus told them. Rather, his writings reflect more of an intimate rendering of Jesus in his ministry, both in his humanity and his divinity. And those of you who study Scripture are familiar with the term synoptic gospels. If you're all familiar with that, they refer to the writings of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Synoptic meaning pretty much that they follow each other. They present the same events, but in different ways. And the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke were all written from the same perspective and probably use some of the same source of materials that the others used for their accounts. John's Gospel, on the other hand, goes much deeper in explaining just who Jesus is in his divine nature. John's Gospel contains allegories and metaphors, but if you notice, there are no parables. There's some that sound like parables, but they're really not. And just to separate the two, an allegory or a metaphor is a story that can communicate a hidden meaning. For example, the story of the Good Shepherd. The vine and the branches is a good example of that, a good example of an allegory. Because in speaking of the vine and the branches, he is, of course, speaking our connection with him as the vine, and we are the branches. And just as the branches are no longer nourished if they are broken off or die off from the vine, we too will spiritually die if we separate ourselves from Christ. Hence, an allegory there. In contrast, a parable is a simple story. It illustrates a moral lesson or spiritual lesson. Example of this, Pharisees and the tax collector. the moneylender, and the two debtors. These are plausible events. These are events that actually could have taken place. Nothing is hidden in there other than lessons in humility and lessons in mercy. So what's really neat about John is his depth of understanding of Jesus' divinity, which becomes evident when, instead of choosing to begin with the story of the birth of Jesus, or going back to Abraham, which, from the Jewish tradition, it was kind of the beginning. That wasn't the beginning. He goes way back in the beginning before anything was really created. And I love the way he begins his gospel. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Who's the Word? My hearing's going bad. Who's the Word? Jesus, right. So, he recognized the fact that Jesus was God. There's no question that he's presenting Jesus and God as one entity. John's gospel, although if you've tried reading it, is difficult to understand at times because of all the layers of meaning. They carry the most spiritual of messages for me anyway, but there's so many layers in there. You almost have to read it 2, 3, 4, 5 times to really get an understanding of what John's talking about. Now, my guess, going down the road, and we will see John, writing some more things, but they're all from a different aspect or different perspective than the other Gospels. The second thing was that rebuke of Big James and John for their arrogance. If you recall, it was their mother that asked, could you have my 2 sons sit one on your right and one on your left? That didn't sit too well with Jesus, nor did it sit too well with the other disciples. They were chastised for their arrogance of who was better among them, and their prejudice, particularly against the Samaritans. And of course, all the Jews were prejudiced against the Samaritans. But according to this episode, Big James and John were the most vocal, and they were wanting Jesus to bring down all sorts of calamity on them. And again, add to this the question of their mother intervening in there and asking Jesus to put them, in a high spot, in a position of authority, open them up as a target for Jesus to use in his teaching ministry, particularly a ministry about mercy and forgiveness. So, what do we got? The plowing of the field under the guise of their yield feeding future travelers. Arrogance or pride. Think about arrogance or pride. One of the seven deadly sins. Why is arrogance or pride one of the 7 deadly sins? There's nothing wrong with taking pride in one's accomplishments. Healthy pride recognizes that those accomplishments are a result of God's generous gifts to us, and they allow us to achieve our goals, but we need to share those with others. Unhealthy pride, on the other by comparison, we think more highly of that we are responsible, that God has no part of our success, that we highly value ourselves in our relationships with others, and that value is actually tends to overvalue ourselves. It overvalues the contributions that we make to a group. And unhealthy pride, and again, I think this is why it's one of the 7 deadliest sins, unhealthy pride leads to bullying, arrogance, and aggressive behavior. And isn't this where Big James and John were heading? Tied into this second segment is that third important message that I got from this episode, and that's the mercy and the forgiveness that Jesus is trying to instill in his disciples. Now, obviously, there's so many other things that happen, but I'm just talking about the things that stood out to me the most and things that I hope to share with you. The story of the Good Samaritan has been presented and preached upon ad nauseum. We've all heard it. In fact, I think sometimes it's even twice in a cycle, depending on what year it is. But it's always pretty much the same thing. We talk about, this poor schlep that gets beat up and left there, and the priest comes by. I can see that. Does nothing. Then some other guy comes by, and finally the Samaritan, and then he makes a point of it being a Samaritan because, the Samaritans were hated by the Jews. And we're taught that story is about random acts of kindness, which it is. But the point that Jesus is trying to make, kindness is one thing, but being kind to those whom you don't like and not expecting anything in return is the core of his message. And as true as these are, this episode brilliantly takes the story of the Good Samaritan and hits us right between the eyes by using Big James and John as a lesson in humility and a lesson in forgiveness. And the way that the Good Samaritan story is portrayed through the eyes of the robber is absolutely fantastic. It's something I'd never even thought of in this. Now, did this actually happen? Was it really happening this way? My guess, probably not. But who cares? It was a great story, and the way they presented it in here really gets you thinking about the point of not being too quick to judge and not withhold mercy and forgiveness. And what better way to teach a lesson such as this to a couple of arrogant, prejudiced people, as well as to the whole world, about what unconditional love truly is? I want to share a story with you about forgiveness. You may have heard this story before if any of you attended any of my Lenten talks. It teaches us about not only us forgiving others, but also asking for people's forgiveness when we may have hurt them. And I think that of all the qualities that an individual possesses, the willingness to forgive is perhaps one of the most difficult to practice. There's a quote about forgiveness that goes like this: "Forgiveness is the key that unlocks the door of resentment and the handcuffs of hate. Forgiveness is the power that breaks the chains of bitterness and the shackle of selfishness." Think about that. I'm embarrassed to say that I have trouble letting go at times. Maybe it's the Sicilian in me. I can carry a grudge to the grave, and along with many of my family members. But forgiveness does not only relieve the sinner of his burden, but also the one who's sinned against. But forgiveness is not an easy thing to offer, because you want to think, how do you forgive the unforgivable? The unforgivable. And there is such a thing. There are people that have done atrocities out there that you would think are unforgivable. Well, someone who has hurt you so badly that you find it impossible to forgive, there's an answer to how to forgive the unforgivable. And that question was raised by Simon Wiesenthal's book, The Sunflower. Is anybody familiar with that? No, The Sunflower, Simon Wiesenthal's. Good, then this is a fresh story for you. The book is about an incident during the 2 years that Simon Wiesenthal spent in a Nazi concentration camp. 89 of his members had died in this concentration camp, and he had watched as they were gunned down helplessly. His mother, who he loved, was shoved into a boxcar, never to be seen again, ridden off to her death. And this is his powerful story. One day, when he was in the concentration camp, a nurse came out to where he was working, tapped him on the shoulder, and asked him to follow her. He was taken to this makeshift hospital to a very small room, and there, in that room, was a single bed. On this bed is a person who is almost completely wrapped in bandages, and it's obvious that this person is going to die. So he goes into that room, and what he sees in this bandaged body is this dying person that's struggling to begin to speak. And this body is that of a young man, 21 years old, a member of that dreaded SS troops. And he'd been raised a Catholic, but in his teens, he had joined the Hitler Youth. He abandoned his Catholicism in favor of this new religion, Hitler, which demanded total obedience to Adolf Hitler. And when the war broke out, he volunteered immediately for these elite SS troops because he wanted to be part of this quick and easy victory that the propaganda had promised him. And while he was in the Eastern Zone, he had been given the assignment of dealing with the Jews in that local area. His unit gathered up all the Jews, herded them into a building, doused the building with gasoline, and set up machine guns outside to take care of those who tried to escape the fire. Could you imagine the effect that would have on anyone that witnessed something like this? And this incident that troubled the young SS trooper. He began to be preoccupied with what he had done, and he grew careless. And as a result of that carelessness, he got wounded pretty badly in a skirmish. So now he's lying bandaged and dying in an isolated room. And one of the things, and probably the most important things that he wanted above all, was forgiveness. And so he requested that a Jew be sent in. And just by circumstance, it happened to be Simon Wiesenthal, who had gone into the room, and he listened to the man's plea. Now this young boy said that he was not born a murderer, and he did not want to die a murderer, so he begged Simon to, on behalf of his people, for forgiveness. Wiesenthal said that the only response he can give was to get up, walk out of the room without saying a word, and without granting forgiveness. Later on, his actions troubled him. Should he have granted forgiveness? That trooper had been part of all kinds of atrocities, murder and killing. Was forgiveness possible, and should he have granted it? And he concludes the story by asking the reader, you and me, to put ourselves in his shoes and ask ourselves the question, what would I have done? Very interesting question, very poignant question. What would you and I have done? If we were in his shoes and we were faced with someone representing a group that tortured and killed 89 members of your family, could you have forgiven? And that is quite a question to contemplate. And yet Jesus answers that very question when he's going through the agony on the cross and turns to his Father and pleads, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Obviously, there are so many other things in this episode that we can talk about. But for me, the way that John approaches us, the authoring of that gospel, and the lessons of mercy and forgiveness that are taught are what stood out for me the most. Those three segments in there. So before we break into small groups, are there any questions regarding what I spoke about, whether it's about forgiveness or John's gospel or anything? Any questions? Anything you want to know about John? Anything you want to know about me?
Maybe they're quiet for week one. It's okay. They're just quiet today.
They're just quiet today. The full bellies of pancakes.
That's right. It was a big breakfast today.
That's right. Okay, so we can break into your small group.
Thank you so much, Deacon Tony. We appreciate you as always. So at this point, we're going to break up into small groups. Sarah Comey is filling in for Aaron Kerr this week, and we're going to ask that group circles up chairs in this back corner here. Sister Nancy Fisher will be back in the Finley room. And Rick Lamb's group is going to be in the sacristy, and you walk there through this little doorway near the reservation chapel. If you don't know what small group you're in, pop by and see me on the walk over if I haven't already told you, and we'll get you all situated. And leaders, if you could be back here in the church, I'll call you back around 11:20.